So every object in space is indeed not stationary but is moving through time, that is to say, from birth till death. So what sustains this period of all times in all places is hyperspace. So all the planets, all the people, all the plants, all the animals, all the minerals are moving through time. So your highest timeline is hyperspace. It is eternity. Good day to you all. My name is Bradley Mavudzi. I am a certified scholar in sociology, a former stage magician, as well as a certified spiritual life coach and a neuro-linguistic programming practitioner. Currently, I am an English teacher and global perspective teacher at Hillbright Science College. Now, today we're going to delve into a topic that I've spent quite some time researching about, as well as practically engaging in order to further my understanding in my parallel studies. So basically, the aims of this presentation are to highlight the multiple dimensions which a single individual has. And of course, in order to do this, I'm going to be using different esoteric traditions, as well as research on spirituality, research in psychology and sociology as well. So before I start, I always like to give a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is basically this: this knowledge is neutral and merely for educational purposes. It is not meant to support any particular doctrine or sect, but rather to highlight neutral, metaphysical, natural laws. So, in other words, it is knowledge which is neutral. Currently, I've been, not currently, recently, I've been debating with people about knowledge, and some people seem to think that knowledge is a negative thing. And I always tell them the same thing, which is that knowledge is simply like a knife. You can either use the knife to spread butter on your bread, or you can use it to stab someone. So the knife is not the problem. The individual wielding the knife is basically what is going to determine the results of what that knife is going to be used for. So again, this knowledge is neutral and merely for educational purposes. Furthermore, you don't have to believe anything that is presented in this presentation. It is out there for debate. It is possible for individuals to critique, to pass their own judgments, their own opinions. Regardless of what people will say, the information is objective and is backed up by research and researchers who have delved into these dimensions on a much more deeper and profound level. So I'm just going to be touching on the surface, and I'm going to try to go a little bit deeper so that we understand what we are talking about. With that being said, let us jump right in. How many times have I said that? So if we basically look at the slide, we are going to notice that the individual is multi-dimensional. The individual human being is a multi-dimensional creature, if you want to use that word. That is to say, the individual human being is not merely just social, but we are also biological, we are also emotional, mental, and above that, spiritual. So we're going to look at all those dimensions and how they interrelate. I also chose the term spectrum in order to highlight that there is no clear boundary between these dimensions. In other words, the boundaries or the lines which we draw between where their mind even ends and the body begins, these are arbitrary lines. So it would be much better to think of it as a spectrum, a continuum, which is one energy but modified in different forms. So you can think of it as water. Water can be liquid, solid, or vapor. But where does the solid stop and the liquid start? So the divisions are clearly arbitrary. So it's easier to think of it as one thing which changes form depending on the external circumstance or depending on the environment. So it is a spectrum, but it is one energy or one being, which is you. So let us begin with the first dimension. Part one, the social ego. So if you look at the slide here, it says that this is the role the body plays, but it is not the body. The role of being a father, the role of being a mother, the role of being a son, daughter, doctor, teacher, actor, or musician. In other words, this is a two-dimensional construct. It is on an X-plane, which is why when people say, well, tell me about yourself, in other words, you're explaining yourself. So you put yourself on an X-plane and you say, my name is so-and-so. I do this and this for a living, and basically I come from this culture or from this race. So this is what we call in sociology and psychology the social ego. So the social ego is a language construct based on feedback from our surrounding peers, family, teachers, and immediate guardians. In sociological and psychological terms, it is the internalized other. So what this phrase means is that when we say the internalized other, we're trying to say that the personality that we receive from our culture through social learning theory is not our innate self, nor is it our spiritual self. It is sustained through verbal communication as we tell each other who we are based on who we were yesterday, where we culturally come from, and what we have done. So if you think about it, when someone says, tell me about yourself, what you basically do is you tell them about your two-dimensional self, the X-plane. You explain who you are. But notice that nobody ever says, I have a liver, I have a stomach, I have intestines, I have a brain, I have a pineal gland, I have veins, I have blood. But this is part of you. This is a feature of you. So it is a social convention when someone says, tell me about yourself. We dive straight into the personality and we ignore the other dimension, which we'll come into just now, which is the biological dimension. So it is important to understand these dimensions so that we are not lost or caught up in a lower dimension in which we have very little control. That's why this presentation is important. Furthermore, the social ego is sustained through verbal communication, and the social ego only exists because of other social egos. So the social ego is basically a reflection. When you're a child and you see your parents, they talk to you, they give you a name, they tell you who you are, you're basically internalizing the other, that is society, in order to be a reasonable, functioning, and respectable social individual. So it is an important aspect of the human being, very important. I wouldn't be able to give this presentation if I didn't have a social ego. So it plays a part in filtering and condensing the higher dimensions, which we'll talk about shortly. So the social ego in esoteric religious literature is what we call a Luciferic existence, or Lucifer, the light bearer, as he is called in Latin, which means light. So it is the light bearer which shines in the chaos and the unpredictability of nature, and it attempts to bring forth order out of what we call chaos. So it's basically The ego, or the social ego, also has what we call a superego. So Sigmund Freud in psychology coined these terms, the ego and the superego. So the superego is basically our conscience, where we have social morals. We know the boundaries. We know that we're not supposed to walk up to that person and invade their boundaries. This is the superego, which puts the body in check. Otherwise, what would happen is what Freud called the id, which is the instinctual self, might override the individual's consciousness, which might lead them to become a beast. This is why the social ego or the superego is important. It does bring order out of the chaos. Hence, in religious esoteric literature, they defined it as the Luciferic element. So, if we understand Lucifer, it is the archetype of pride. Hence, the conventional cultural phrase, which we always hear now and again: be proud of your country or be proud of your race. So the social ego works through the mirror effect, which we pick up from childhood. So when we receive the social ego, we are embodying that archetype of being a proud, individual, independent, social being in a capitalistic society. Nonetheless, it is only a mere slice of the multi-dimensional human spectrum of the human being. So we can have a lot of people in a global society who spend their entire life in this dimension, never realizing that there's more to them than the ego. So they might define themselves as a father, they might define themselves as an actor, a musician, a teacher, or a doctor. But like I said, this is just a slice of the multi-dimensional spectrum of the human being. So in this presentation, what I'm doing right now, I'm using language for purposes of discussion to point to dimensions which really the individual has to experience for themselves. So this is a form of a literary artwork, which in essence is just appreciating the other dimensions, which cannot be tamed by language, but can rather be appreciated by pointing to the beauty of the metaphysical spectrum of existence. So the ancient philosopher Plato, he's one of my favorite philosophers. He once said, "The three factors that the Son of Man must focus on are the true, the good, and the beautiful." So in this presentation, we're going to focus on the beautiful mathematical and literary interwoven fabric of celestial and terrestrial existence. Let's move on to the next dimension. So the next dimension which I'm going to discuss is the body, the physical biological organism centered here and now. So the body is not the social ego. I will repeat, the body is not the social ego. It is also not the personality. In fact, the body is also not your name. However, by calling one's name in a room, when someone says, "James, come over here," their body can be summoned to move in the third dimension or in the three-dimensional space by the summoner who understands the power of language. Now, if James is a little bit aware of these dimensions, he could choose to say no, because he understands that he is not just a two-dimensional being. So he's not just James. He could choose to let his body stay wherever it is or just walk away. So this is the biological dimension. And note the difference. The first dimension is ruled by social concepts, social conventions, which bring order to the id, or the biological instinctive human being, the social animal, from the biological animal. But the physical body, the biological body, is not two-dimensional. It is third-dimensional. So it's a little bit higher than the lower dimensions, where we have our social ego and our social roles, which we play for purposes of discussion. Furthermore, I just mentioned previously that when someone asks you to tell them about yourself, no one ever says that I have a liver, or I have two eyes, or basically I have veins, a brain, pineal gland, and all of that. But this is also part of yourself. And one can even argue that this part of yourself might be more real than the ephemeral social ego, which is only relative to the society one finds themselves in. So one's personality in particular, let me repeat that phrase, one's personality in a particular first world country would be totally out of place in an ancient time. But the body would still be the body, centered here and now as a physical biological organism, which means that biology should also be put into consideration when one is aspiring to self-knowledge. So we cannot ignore the body. We cannot forget the body. By becoming entranced and completely hypnotized by the social ego, the body always has to be remembered. Now, why is that important? Well, because of its timelessness and the way it transcends social conventions in a particular culture. The body contains much wisdom and intelligence than the social ego. Knowledge about the cosmos, nature, and spirit. The social ego can only receive the effects as filtered information. So the body transcends the dimension of social convention. But nonetheless, it must be kept in check by higher natural laws in higher dimensions, which we'll discuss shortly. So what we're saying is, when you're aware of the body, you also have to be aware that the eyes of the body are always looking out from where your attention is coming from. So if you can keep awareness of your physical environment from this moment going on forward, you're going to get what I call personal gnosis, personal knowledge of the third dimension. You're going to see the places that you visit, the people that you always see, the loops, the repetitions that you always repeat. And from this knowledge, you can then have the audacity to change your third dimensional reality, if you wish to do so, of course. And basically be in a state where you are creating the reality on your screen of physical life that you at least find to be peaceful and tolerable. Because if you only exist in the second dimension, 2D, that is social convention, social ego, then that ego is going to be running your biological organism rather than you as the body controlling your personality. Because if the personality is controlling the body, there is a certain element whereby other people's personalities can also hook into yours to get you to do something that you physically don't want to do. Why? Well, because my name is James, and basically James does A, B, and C. James likes to drink, James likes to gamble, James likes to... You get the point, right? But James is not the body. That's what you have to realize, that as a physical, biological organism, you always have a choice to detach from the social ego and do what you want to do. So that is the lost word in Freemasonry, which they say the lost word is no. And once you adopt say no many times, you take back your power as a physical, biological organism. So you're now fully third dimensional. And of course, in order to interact for social purposes, purposes of discussion, you have your social ego. You use your social ego as a tool rather than it using you. So the power dynamics in this situation change because the social ego is in a lower linguistic dimensional slice. But who uses language? Who uses the social ego? That's the question. So forgetting that you're a third dimensional being means that one has forgotten their body and is easily swept away by different personalities in different directions with very little awareness. Even one's own social ego can completely take control of the body and lead it into destruction. At the same time, the ego can be used to lead one to success, but we're not going to be talking about that in this presentation. So this is why it is important to be constantly aware of the biological dimension. So that is to say, we become aware of what we eat, what we see with our two physical eyes, and the people we interact with, because all these impressions are immediately absorbed into our other dimensions and they become a part of us. So let's now move on to the next dimension. If we look at the slide here, we have the vital or the fourth dimension. So we've talked about the fourth dimension on this channel before, but we're just going to talk about it from a different lens. Today we're going to be looking at it from a more psychological as well as spiritual lens. So the physical body is enlivened by energy, vital energy. When one is born, they have a certain amount of energy. They eat, and when they see impressions through television and books, as well as conversations and lectures, one is trading energy in order to acquire different experiences in the two previously discussed dimensions. So in other words, for you to have a physical body, that body would not exist without the fourth dimension. This is the dimension of energy. So when one is born, they have a certain amount of energy. Every third dimensional object, including physical bodies, animals, people, etc., are rooted in the fourth dimension. That is the dimension of time. So when you look at an apple, you're holding an apple. You're looking at the physical body of a fourth dimensional energy construct. So that energy enlivens the body. In other words, every physical object is moving in time, no matter how stationary it might look. It has a beginning and it lasts for however long it lasts, and eventually it goes back into the fourth dimension, pure energy. It evaporates, it dissolutes, it sublimates, or it can condense and become even more crystallized, depending on how the energy is used. So going on further, all of this that we're doing is possible because of energy. So the energy cannot be destroyed, but it can only be transformed. So this is a discovery in physics, that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but it is only transformed, which means that the entire universe has a certain amount of infinite energy, and that energy can only be transformed, but it can be destroyed. So it only transforms from one state into another state. Nonetheless, when one is born, they have untapped energy, which can become something. This is vital energy, which enlivens and nourishes the multi-dimensional human being. So energy then enlivens the individual's life. One is if one is not careful, if one is not careful, their energy can easily be exhausted and sucked quickly by the egos that exist in the lower dimensions that need fuel in order for them to exist. So the egos, which we previously mentioned, actually exist because of vital energy in the fourth dimension, which is why when you overuse your personality, you feel drained. When you're constantly around people who are overly stimulating your personality and their personality, you feel drained afterwards. Why? Because the energy which is enlivening those egos and stimulating the personality is really your fourth dimensional vital energy. Let's move on. So, the same energy can also be used to fuel the higher dimensions. So, this is the crux of the matter. Two ways to use the same energy, right? You have energy in your vital body, in your vital dimension, in the fourth dimension. You can either use that to fuel the social ego, becoming more enlivened in those dimensions, or you can do the opposite, or you can do both. So the opposite would be to fuel the higher dimensions, which contain cosmic beauty and metaphysical realizations. So without ample energy, the higher dimensions cannot be brought to light. Just like in order to see the objects in a room at night or during the day, there has to be a form of electrical energy which has to be converted into light energy in order to see what is there. So in other words, what we're saying here is that in order to see the higher dimensions, you cannot do that if there's no energy. There has to be energy which needs to be converted into light energy. And when there's light, uh, physics can testify that wherever there's light, there is vision. And wherever there's vision, there is attention, your attention. So your attention can be directed into the higher dimensions to see cosmic beauty and metaphysical structures which are obviously hard to explain. They're personal, they're subjective, but at the same time, they are similar across different cultures. So the vital or fourth dimension is the region of energy, which can either be used to stimulate the lower dimensions or to rise up and uh, light up, illuminate the higher dimensions. Going on to the next slide, we see here that we have the psychic dimension. So the psychic dimension is divided into two. We have the astral and the mental. Some traditions, some esoteric traditions, basically just call it the mental sphere. In Japanese culture, Zen culture, it is basically one dimension, and they locate it in their hearts. But for purposes of discussion, I'm going to be more specific so that we divide the two and understand the subtle difference between these two dimensions, the astral and the mental. So let's begin with the astral dimension. The astral dimension is related to emotion. As everything in nature, it has a polarity, negative and positive. So for this presentation, we're not going to be taking sides. We're just going to mention the dimension from an objective point of view. It has a polarity, that is negative emotion and positive emotion. So the emotional spectrum ranges from high to low, and depending on the vibration, one chooses to energize. So one can choose to energize the emotions ascending up. If we look on the right, we have a very beautiful pictorial metaphor of the emotional dimension. At the bottom, we have emotions like shame, guilt, bitterness, low self esteem, humiliation, blame, sorrow, negative self talk, anger, revenge, doubt, depression, and basically grief. There's nothing wrong with these emotions. The human being fluctuates. I mean, in order to be a normal human being, you must fluctuate from the bottom to the top. So we call this the law of the pendulum, whereby when you feel elated, ecstatic, exuberant, excited, the law of the pendulum says that energy has to return. So for every high, there has to be a preceding low that follows afterwards. For every high, there has to be a low which follows afterwards. This is normal. What is abnormal in psychology is when individuals try to sustain an emotional state of hyper vigilance. That is, when you try to sustain joy, you begin to damage your astral dimension, because in order for there to be joy, there has to be pain. In order for there to be depression, there also has to be the opposite polarity, which is unconditional love. So fluctuating between these two states makes you a normal human being. Staying in one state becomes what we call a disorder. So that energy has to flow freely in that dimension. Furthermore, the astral dimension deals with desires, fears, hopes, and dreams that the individual seeks to achieve in their physical existence. And if it is nourished and protected, an emotional resonance can be achieved, and eventually the physical will match the astral. So in other words, some people who already know what I'm talking about would know that in order to have a good physical life, you also have to put your emotions in check. By putting your emotions on a high vibrational level and having that as a default, your physical life eventually will start to work for you. Things will start to change around you. Not because you put in a lot of effort physically, but just because you just changed your emotional vibration. So as Nikola Tesla once said, in order to understand the secrets of the universe, you must think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. So vibration is important. In your astral dimension, you must be aware which level are you vibrating on a daily basis. There must be a default. And the default should not be the negative polarity, because it's only going to attract that which is unwanted. So if you have positive self-talk, confidence, joy, patience, humility, productive expectation, and an organized, courageous attitude, then your physical existence slowly, as we all know, nature does not work in straight lines. It's very slow, but eventually the effects will follow. Moving on. The astral dimension, as we mentioned, deals with fears and hopes, which is why those who feel life on a high emotional vibration attract the type of luxury and physical existence, while those who vibrate on a lower astral frequency in terms of hopelessness, defeat, and apathy will also manifest that in their physical reality. So in this state, we then have individuals who blame shift. They blame God, they blame their parents, they blame themselves, which is the last one is a good one. Because really what's happening here is it is your dimensions that are manifesting the realities that you are constantly seeing on a daily basis, which is why it's important to retain your energy so that you illuminate these dimensions and change them in order to change your physical reality. So by changing the higher or deeper dimensions, let me just take a detour. So when we talk about these dimensions, you can either think of them as going higher or going deeper. These are two different ways of looking at it. Personally, I like to use the word deeper because you are going within yourself in order to change certain vibrational inconsistencies so that they match your expectations. And with patience, the physical effects should also follow. So by changing the higher or deeper dimensions, the lower dimensions will simultaneously follow. It is a law of nature, the law of cause and effect, which we've also discussed on this channel. So as the ancient Greek seer Hermes Trismegistus, we also talked about him before, as he mentioned in his ancient tablets of Thoth, as above, so below. This means as your emotions vibrate at a certain frequency, your physical body eventually is going to follow that rhythm, that hypnotic rhythm. So if your emotions are constantly vibrating with positive self-talk, with positive confidence, happiness, acceptance, which is the one I recommend people start with, that is contentment, what then begins to happen is that your physical existence starts to feed back into what you're feeling. Because when you are feeling something deeply, you attract it, whether you realize it or not. So that's the ancient maxim from Thoth, his Egyptian name, or Hermes, the Greek term, the Greek name which is used in Greek literature. As above, so below. Moving on to the next dimension, we go to the mental dimension. So this is why I differentiated between mental and astral, because there's a subtle difference which the individual human being must make within themselves. Emotions are not the same as thoughts. However, thoughts can be driven by emotions, and emotions can also be driven by thoughts. But there is a subtle difference which is important to make if one wants to be very effective in whatever they're doing. So the mental dimension deals with information, thoughts, and reasoning. It is the dimension of words and symbols. In other words, it is the dimension of spells, literally spellings. So when we are young, we are taught how to spell. We are also spelled by our guardians through language. So these spellings, which we use on a daily basis, right now I am using English. These are the spellings, the spells which I'm speaking. But notice that you use them every day. You use spellings every single day. These spellings, these spells reside in the mental dimension, the world of symbols, the world of thoughts, the world of reasoning, the world of information. So in this dimension, words hold great power. The power to create and the power to destroy, depending on the individual's idiosyncrasies. On a mundane, conventional level, we use this dimension for data and analysis, as well as labeling and comparing. So we use the mental dimension on the mundane level for basic things like analyzing, counting money, thinking about the next goal, or basically just analyzing data that we see on a daily basis. Charts, symbols, diagrams, etc., etc. Let me just highlight something about this dimension that is worth noting. The mental dimension vibrates much slower than the previous dimensions. So in other words, the physical body moves faster than the emotions, and the emotions move much faster than the thoughts. So the thoughts, even though they might seem like they're very fast, they're actually the slowest. You can actually slow down your mind to a point where you think one word at a time, consciously thinking one word at a time. So this is slowing down the dimensions. You're in a slower dimension. Now, most people might think, I don't want to be slow, but let's look at it again. First of all, if someone was sitting under an apple tree and then they see an apple falling from the tree, and basically they can tell that that apple is going to hit my head, if they try to think and analyze which way they should move, the apple will hit their head, which shows that the mental dimension is vibrating at a much slower frequency than the body, which can be instinctive and immediately take action. So if you think about which way to go when an apple is about to fall on your head, you'll be too slow and the apple will hit your head, right? Nonetheless, the mental dimension has the capability to travel far beyond the physical or personality. Also, it can place accurate and calculative plans, which the astral and physical body can then naturally follow in order to avoid avoidable mistakes. So that is to say, one can think before they do something. Instead of being driven by emotions and acting out on impulse, one can stop, slow down, think about it, weigh the pros and cons of that decision, and you've done the mental analysis of the situation, you can then take real world action based on the information and the knowledge that you've acquired. So the action that you take, which is informed by the mental dimension, depending on your knowledge, will be more effective, more calculated, and less destructive because you thought about it first before you did it. So, thus, the mental dimension of reasoning lays out a map on the lower dimensions by labeling everything below it in an attempt to study and analyze it in order to predict the future behaviors of the receding dimensions. So, this is how one can become a lord of the emotions and the body by only engaging their mental dimension for a better existence for themselves and others. So, one may argue that contemporary society as we see it today, global society, the global village as a whole, is truly governed from the mental dimension. And it is hard to spot this because, from the social third dimensional human civilization view, it seems as though the world is moving very fast, when indeed it is being driven from a higher dimension which is slow and calculative, pulling and pushing the levers in different directions, either from the astral or the mental dimensions of conceptual synthesis. So, this phrase is just saying that every human being is an unknowing poet or an unknowing philosopher. That is, everyone has metaphysics, whether they know it or not. Because what drives someone to wake up in the morning and go and make money? What pushes someone to wake up in the morning and go to that job and acquire what it is they want to acquire? What pushed me to make this presentation? So, in other words, we're saying everyone is either a knowing or an unknowing poet. As we move in life, our story can be rewritten in the astral and mental dimensions in order to create a new physical trajectory. So, this is good news, folks, because this means your life is not fated. It could look that way because if you view it from a two-dimensional sphere, that is, you have a name and you have a culture, you have your family and your relatives who have told you this, and that about you, but really that's not you. It's just a two-dimensional sphere, which, if you are in touch with your body, is laughable. Furthermore, if you're in touch with your energy and further that, you can go above and get into the astral and mental planes and realize, wait a minute, who's holding the pen? So a simple example would be to consciously choose a different route to work than the usual one. So instinctively, impulsively, we could use the same route to work every day. we could use the same route to the shops, to the shopping mall every day. That's because either we're being driven by emotions or we're just acting out on instinct and impulse, which Napoleon Hill talked about in his book, Outwitting the Devil. Great book. If you have time, check it out. He mentions hypnotic rhythm, whereby our physical bodies can be hypnotized in such a way that we do the same things the same way over and over again. If you want to break the habit of hypnotic rhythm, start by brushing your teeth with your opposite hand. Start by putting the opposite leg when you're wearing your pants than you usually do. Wake up in the morning, say something that you've never said before, and slowly but surely you are engaging the mental dimension. So you're exercising, mental exercising. This is how you take control of that dimension in order to change or rewrite the story which you want to see on the screen of your life. So this is exercising the mental dimension for oneself. And then later on, you observe the physical results that follow. So this is not unscientific. This is very scientific. It is a social science which transcends into a spiritual science. And if you combine the two, you have a conjunction at the middle, and we can call that metaphysics or a multidimensional existence. So this is the mental dimension. It is, we could go deeper and deeper into it. It has many different aspects, many different levels. There are people who have total control in the mental dimension and they use it for control, coercion, manipulation. I call them dark sorcerers. But we're not talking about them today. So let's move on to the next dimension. Now, if we look at the slide on the screen, our journey has taken us from being just Mary or being just James to hyperspace. So we've come a long way. So hyperspace in esoteric literature, for example, in Gnosticism or the Kabbalah, the mystic Jewish Kabbalah, they call it the absolute abstract space. Mathematicians who study sacred geometry call it the zero dimension. Voyages of the higher dimensions would call it hyperspace. Regardless of the name, like we mentioned, the two-dimensional names don't change the reality of the metaphysics of that dimension. But let's try and appreciate what this dimension has to say to us. So returning to source means returning to the zero dimension or hyperspace. So hyperspace is the dimension which gives infinite room for infinite possibilities. It is the space that has the potential to cleanse the psychic dimensions of discursive thought and emotion by revealing itself as empty space in which something new can arise. So in other words, civilization as we know it is usually divorced from hyperspace. We barely touch hyperspace in our daily activities. And what's ironic is that dimension is everywhere. It's literally right here, right now. It's going to be there tomorrow. It's been here centuries ago. It's going to be there in the next 50,000 years. It's still going to be hyperspace. It's still going to be the zero dimension. So hyperspace is the dimension which gives infinite room for infinite possibilities. It is pure potentiality, unmodified by any effect. It is the dimension that the sages, the gurus, the esoteric masters, and the seers use to heal psychic turmoil. It is a dimension in itself, and no one personality owns it. That is very important to understand because it means no one can come to you and say, I'm going to show you hyperspace, or I'm going to show you the zero dimension. It's impossible. It can't happen that way because no personality can point it to you. You have to tap into it. So it is basically like the sky. It is everywhere and remains unpolluted by thoughts, emotions, or physical phenomena. And as I mentioned, in esoteric literature such as Kabbalah and Gnosticism, it is symbolized as the absolute sun, always ever present, and allows for its presence to light the entire space in order for all the other dimensions to thrive. However, it is more than just physical light, it is psychic light resembling space. So the zero dimension can be symbolized as empty space. But the empty space is that invisible dimension which allows for everything else to be seen. So, quoting one of my favorite philosophers, Alan Watts, he took it into a religious dimension and he said, if God was visible, nobody could see anything but God. So God had to remove himself in terms of visibility, make himself invisible in order for the world to be seen, in order for the beauty to express itself, in order for the different forms in their uniqueness, in their diversity, to celebrate existence, to celebrate that absolute abstract space. Now, let's see if we can actually paint a psychic, intuitive symbol or image of the zero dimension using this example. Now, imagine that you're in an empty room without any furniture. You just arrived in this room and there's no furniture, just empty. Now, the room holds pure potentiality. There's nothing there yet. So as one begins to fill up the room, chairs, tables, TVs, dressing boards, etc., etc., it appears that the space begins to disappear, and at times it becomes even hard to move in the room. So you might find yourself, initially there was nothing there, now you're trying to navigate just to make it to the kitchen. But in reality, the space is still there, just obscured by visual objects and auditory phenomena. So that's sound and vision. But sound and vision can only exist if there's something that is neither sound nor visual. That is empty space. So the visual objects are the third dimensional objects that occupy space, and the auditory phenomena, that is sound. So whether from real people or the television or the radio, the sound is still the sound. Immediately, the empty space collapses into visual and auditory phenomena. So we start with the zero dimension, empty space, and it collapses into visual objects and sound. So we now have a third dimensional phenomena. You can also collapse the zero dimension, and then you have thoughts, the first thought that you think. If you could remember the first thought that you had, that would be pretty fantastic. But do ask yourself the question, what was the first thought that you had? Do you remember? Do you remember how your line of thinking, or where your line of thinking started? Well, I can tell you, it started from the zero dimension. That's where you begin, in a timeless dimension. And then you collapse into thoughts, emotions, and then you have your physical body moving around and you have a life, existence. So from this point of view, from the third dimension, it seems as if the individual organisms are way out in space, lost. But really, the good news is that they're not lost, because the zero dimension is, like we said, empty space. It is everywhere. It just allows for everything else to visually exist. That is the beauty of metaphysics. So, like we said, immediately the empty space collapses into visual and auditory phenomena. In esoteric religious literature, one would say the absolute abstract space sacrifices itself in order for everything else to exist. It moves out of the way, becoming almost invisible so that the visibility and phenomenon occurs. So for there to be plants, trees, the sun, the sky, people, thoughts, feelings, human interaction, all of that is happening in space. But nobody ever sees the space. Nobody ever wonders, what are we in? What are we interacting in? Where is the light coming from? Rather, it must be contained in some form of vacuum or void. And this void, as we are now seeing, is what we call hyperspace or the zero dimension. So the good news is that it is indestructible, and all matter, whether physical or psychic, has its roots in the absolute abstract space. Even you, as a psychic and physical being, came from your own particular hyperspace or zero dimension. So in cosmology, they say that the purpose of existence, of physical existence and psychic existence, is to return to the zero dimension with complete consciousness and deliberation of that. So in other words, instead of being bewildered by what is going on around you and what is going to happen tomorrow and what is going to happen in the next few years, you realize hyperspace right now. In this very moment, you realize that your roots are not just your parents, your physical parents, because they also have their roots, their physical parents, and you go all the way back. But this is just the third dimension. Where is the third dimension coming from? The infinite energy that we talked about. Well, where is that infinite energy coming from? Well, we could go all the way back up and realize that it is coming from the zero dimension, which is timeless, eternal, and ever present. So all timelines in all places and all times are happening right now in hyperspace. In hyperspace. So maintaining awareness of hyperspace in daily activities, just as one maintains awareness of the physical body, this brings one closer to spiritual liberation, because all phenomena are perceived as they truly are in hyperspace, which is empty of form. So when you see the world out there, all the trees, all the people, all the cars going wherever they're going, all this phenomena, it seems like a labyrinth. But that is only if you view it from your social ego, or if you try to tame it with your mind, your reasoning. You can't completely tame it with your reasoning. But if you merge with hyperspace, you realize that in every object there is a zero dimension. The same way in your body, you are coming from the zero dimension. So in that space, everything is really one, because space is everywhere. Try in your mind and imagine a place without space. It's impossible. So the space is infinite. It goes outwards, forever and ever and ever. So the light that we see on a daily basis is in space. So what you're seeing out there is really a neurological experience. So like I mentioned, if one can be aware of the zero dimension and maintain that awareness, which is not easy to do, one becomes less attached to the world. So attachment becomes less, because how can one attach to space when they are space in their absolute form? Already the human individual is spiritually whole. So space can't touch itself. You can't attach to space because you are space. So that spaciousness then allows for everything else to manifest. Everything else that you perceive with your consciousness, your emotions, your thoughts, your physical body, going all the way out into the physical dimension, it's space pervading those objects. So within hyperspace, there are no insides and there are no outsides. All insides and outsides in hyperspace are seen, they're visible. So this is the original state of matter, and it pervades all matters, even social and psychic matters, pun intended. It is Christ consciousness, for in this dimension there are no outsides or insides, like I mentioned. Everything is one, existing in space, even thoughts and emotions. Going deeper into esoteric literature, they compare hyperspace to an invisible fire that enlivens every atom that exists. So instead of thinking of it as hyperspace, certain esoteric religious literature doctrines look at it as an invisible fire that enlivens everything that exists, every atom. And they call it the fire of Christ. They also call it the absolute sun. That is the sun which blazes its glory all the way throughout the cosmos. And other Zen masters would call it the eternal bliss, which is, in esoteric language, they call it Ananda, which is the bliss of the consciousness, because once you're in hyperspace, you're timeless and there's just nothing there but pure happiness. It's just pure happiness because there's no time. So your essence is extracted from the lower dimensions and you get to see everything at once at the same time. But when your essence comes back into society, unfortunately, you will not be able to describe what it is you experienced, because it is obviously mind shattering. How can your essence be ubiquitous? Live in multiple timelines at the same time. Well, the essence, which we are discussing here, the absolute sun, is doing that exactly. And it is doing that through you in this very moment. It is also doing that through your neighbor, through your wife, through your husband, through your son, your daughter, your friends, right now. They are all coming from the zero dimension, whether they know it or not. So if you know that, you have a different view when you look at people, when you look at the world around you. Because you have this almost uncanny feeling that, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but there's an uncanny feeling of familiarity that whenever you look at someone and you look at their eyes, you can almost tell that they know exactly what's going on, you know. Like there's always this familiarity of recognition when the zero dimension realizes the zero dimension. It's like looking into a mirror and realizing it's you. So some spiritual life coaches would say everyone out there is you pushed out. Of course, you can't convince someone of that, because the social ego immediately is going to feel like you are trespassing their boundaries. So I wouldn't advise you to do that, but you can do it with nature. You can go out in nature and see the zero dimensions in all the living creatures, because they also come from the zero dimension. So it's not just human beings. Now, when spiritual life coaches talk about reaching enlightenment, they're really talking about reaching the zero dimension. However, there is a slight twist. Let's go back in history, back in time during the era of the famous Indian mystic who was known as Bodhidharma. His name literally translated Bodhi, which means wisdom, and Dharma, which means truth. He said, trying to reach enlightenment is like trying to grab space. In other words, when someone has the desire to reach enlightenment, that desire is actually an obstacle to enlightenment. So we can even take it further back than Bodhidharma, and then we go to Gautama the Buddha, who also had another profound maxim. And he said, human beings suffer because they desire. So if you compare these two statements, they're very similar. They are saying basically, you can't grab space. Why can't you grab space? Because you are space. So if you spit at the sky, that spit is going to come back onto your face. So in other words, you already have arrived. So trying to bootstrap yourself and transcend and trying to, as Alan Watts called it, one up the universe is not really going to help you spiritually, honestly speaking. But realizing the desire to do that is a good step, because what you've just done is you've just shed light or you've just shed your awareness on your psychic activities, which are the lower dimensions, right? The thoughts and the emotions. But what is it that sees those desires? What is it that is observing the thoughts, the emotions, and the body? If you can get in touch with that, that will teach you more than any lecture, than any book. And you won't need me to tell you anything. Really, I should just stop right here and say good night. But anyways, for purposes of academic prowess and accuracy, let's move on. So Einstein mentioned that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It is only modified. So this means all energy is hyperspace, condensed and reduced into a particular form. In order to have a form, that is density, there must be a dimension free of form, and that is the zero dimension. So every object in space is indeed not stationary, but is moving through time. That is to say, from birth till death. So what sustains this period of all times in all places is hyperspace. So all the planets, all the people, all the plants, all the animals, all the minerals are moving through time. So your highest timeline is hyperspace. It is eternity. It is not the social ego, which is caught up in a global drama. Very interesting to play that game. I can personally testify. But for cosmic duties, it is my duty to give out this knowledge which I've come to understand and study. So nonetheless, the social ego can work on behalf of the absolute sun by transmuting that ineffable eternity into recognizable works of art, literature, music, drama, and even a way of being and interacting with others. So that is bringing a peace of heaven onto earth, in order to show the rest that the infinite light is forever present with us, and it is we who are moving further and further away from it. All civilizations throughout time have done this. The arts, the poetry, the dramas, the music. All of this has been an attempt to bring a piece of heaven onto earth, to transmute the zero dimension of eternity into a piece of art, so that one can see eternity in a speck of dust. Or, as William Blake said, one can see eternity in a grain of sand. So why is this presentation important? Well, it is important because the individual who perceives these dimensions by virtue of effort, which are right here and now and always have been right here and now, the individual reaches a nexus point where they can choose to identify with any of these dimensions, if not all, simultaneously. By identifying and merging with hyperspace, one becomes integrated with eternity, and their social personality still remains but becomes passive in order for the spirit to manifest unmodified by human concepts and ideologies. So by toning down their old social self, they transform that energy into hyperspace and tone up eternity and timelessness, which is the key to spiritual liberation. So with that being said, I think I will end this presentation with a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, that is Terence McKenna. And he stated that if truth is space, then history would be a spiderweb. And to add a little to his quote, I added, and appreciating and seeing the beauty in the spiderweb dissolves the desire of attempting to escape history, for there is no need to escape. You are already there as space, shining your light and extracting the beauty from the web. Indeed, you are a gem in infinite space, here to appreciate infinite cosmic beauty and infinite possibilities that are always in the present moment. With that being said, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention.